Hello everyone, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we gently unspool the threads of the past, inviting your mind to wander and find a quiet comfort in the echoes of bygone eras. Tonight, as the world outside begins to hush its busy hum, we'll drift back to the humid, labyrinthine streets of 1890s New Orleans, a city often romanticised, but which held a brutal, unseen reality for many. We're going to explore what it truly meant to live at the fringes of its society, a life that for some was less a journey and more a quiet, drawn-out sentence. If this calm exploration of history resonates with you, and you find a peaceful moment in these shared whispers of the past, a gentle tap on the follow button and a quiet like are always appreciated. And perhaps, if you feel inclined, share a brief hello in the comments below, letting us know where you're settling in from tonight. Now allow your mind to softly drift as we journey back to a place where every shadow held a story and every breath was a battle. In the late 19th century, particularly within the regulated vice district known as Storyville, New Orleans, operated not just as a bustling port city, but as a crucible under a brutal, unseen power structure. This was not a realm governed by written laws alone, but by a chillingly informal yet utterly absolute system of control. For those dwelling at its absolute fringes, especially the women who plied their trade as harlots, systemic control and dire, often fatal consequences were not merely possibilities. They were the defining, unyielding realities of every single moment. You lived, breathed, and existed within an elaborate, suffocating cage where your very being was continuously shaped by forces far beyond your reach. It was a place where freedom was a forgotten word, and every choice, every movement was scrutinised, weighed and often punished, a constant low thrum of menace that permeated the very cobblestones of the district. This hidden hierarchy, almost entirely invisible to the casual observer strolling through the gaslit streets, was underpinned by a merciless economy of exploitation. It was a stark transactional world where human lives were valued not for their inherent worth, their dreams, or their quiet dignities, but solely for their utility as a commodity. Think of it like a ledger constantly being balanced but always in favour of the house. Your physical form, your time, your very resilience, all were meticulously calculated as assets to be leveraged, depleted and discarded as profit margins dictated. There was no room for sentimentality, no space for the tender complexities of human connection. Only the cold, hard mathematics of supply and demand, where the supply was an endless stream of desperation and the demand was for fleeting, purchased intimacy, meant to be consumed and then forgotten like a cheap cigar. And within this meticulously constructed human apparatus of control and commodification, the very environment of New Orleans itself morphed into a relentless adversary. The city, with its heavy, humid air, its labyrinthine alleyways, and its unique blend of beauty and decay, seemed to conspire with the forces that sought to strip survival from these women. The oppressive climate, the prevalent diseases, the struggling infrastructure all became silent yet powerful allies to the system of exploitation. Imagine a pervasive unseen dampness that seeped into everything, not just the architecture but the very bones and spirits of those who lived there, accelerating their decline. The vibrant life of the city, so often celebrated in song and story, became a suffocating shroud, a beautiful, deceptive prison for those trapped within its confines, constantly reminding them of the world they were denied yet could almost touch. For the harlots of Storyville, then, existence was not merely challenging. It was a constant losing battle against these combined insidious forces. Their lives were an ongoing, drawn-out death sentence, quietly administered not by a judge's gavel or a hangman's noose, but by the relentless grind of their daily realities, the systemic erosion of their health and spirit, and the callous indifference of the society that both created and consumed them. It was a slow, agonizing unravelling, a testament to endurance that ultimately gave way to inevitability, where the promise of tomorrow was merely the certainty of another day of diminishing returns, fading light and inexorable decline. The quiet certainty of diminishing returns and the inexorable decline we spoke of in the last breath of our journey through Storyville found its most tangible, most suffocating expression within the very architecture of daily life there. For those caught within its confines, the district itself was less a place on a map and more a meticulously constructed cage, an intricate network of unspoken rules and power dynamics designed to keep you precisely where you were. It wasn't the kind of cage with visible bars you understand, but one built of economic dependency, societal indifference, and the cold, unyielding grip of those who benefited from your very presence. Every single interaction you had, from the gruff demands of a client to the curt nod of a madam, was in essence a subtle or not so subtle display of control, a constant reminder of your precarious position in this elaborate transactional dance. Imagine waking up each morning within walls that didn't just enclose a room, but seemed to contain your entire future, meticulously predetermined by forces far greater than yourself. This feeling of being encased, of having your life's trajectory already charted by unseen hands, was a pervasive psychological weight. You were not just existing. You were performing every moment of your waking hours for an audience that held all the power. The rules of this performance were clear, though rarely spoken aloud: compliance, deference, and the quiet acceptance of your role. Any deviation, any flicker of independence was met with a swift, often brutal correction. It was a constant low-grade tension, like a string pulled taut threatening to snap at any moment, and you were the one holding it. Within this peculiar ecosystem, every consequence, no matter how small, felt like another calculated step, another heavy footfall drawing you inexorably closer to what many within the district simply called the inevitable end. A missed payment, a perceived insolence, a sudden illness. Each was not just an isolated incident, but a further tightening of the invisible bonds that held you. It was a slow, systemic draining of vitality, where life itself was worn thin by constant use and the relentless pressure of a system that saw you as nothing more than a temporary expendable asset. You might not have seen the finish line, but you certainly felt the ground beneath your feet eroding with every passing day, the foundations of your existence quietly crumbling. The very air in Storyville seemed thick with this unspoken hierarchy, a silent agreement amongst the powerful about who belonged where and what could be done to whom. The governance here wasn't about civic duty or public welfare. It was about maintaining order for profit, about ensuring the gears of exploitation turned smoothly. This meant that the concepts of conflict and dissent, while perhaps flickering faintly in the private thoughts of those most oppressed, were rarely, if ever, allowed to fully materialize. The costs were simply too high. Any attempt to push back to articulate a grievance was met with a swiftness and severity that quickly extinguished such sparks. It was a constant lesson delivered not through lectures but through hard-lived experience. Your suffering was a silent, unacknowledged component of the city's vibrant, thriving facade. The specific, methodical ways in which this control was exerted through the daily machinations of its inhabitants and the chilling indifference of its institutions were perhaps the clearest indicators of this suffocating cage. The quiet hum of control that permeated every brick and every shadowed alley of Storyville often found its most immediate and chilling expression, not in grand proclamations, but in the intimate, unyielding presence of the madam herself. She was the undisputed sovereign within the cramped confines of the cribs, her authority absolute, her word law. Think of her less as a hospitable innkeeper, and more as a calculating warden overseeing her very particular kind of establishment, with an iron will disguised perhaps by a veneer of business acumen. Her reign was one of swift, brutal, and often immediate punishments meted out for any perceived defiance, however minor. A glance held too long, a complaint uttered too loudly, or even a moment of visible weariness could invite her wrath. You quickly learned the subtle signs, the sudden silence that fell upon a room when her footsteps echoed down the hall, the way the other girl's shoulders stiffened imperceptibly, or the precise unblinking focus of her gaze. Defiance in her eyes wasn't just outright rebellion. It was anything that threatened her meticulously managed enterprise. It could be failing to attract enough clients, or daring to question the exorbitant prices she charged for basic necessities, or simply possessing a spirit that seemed a shade too unbroken. The consequences for such perceived transgressions were chillingly efficient. You might find yourself locked in a back room for days, the sounds of the bustling house, a tormenting reminder of lost earnings, the silence a heavy companion as hunger gnawed. Or in a more dramatic, utterly dehumanizing display of power, you might be tossed onto the street without a moment's notice left in little more than a shift, your meagre belongings a silent offering to the dust. The suddenness of it, the raw vulnerability of being exposed to the indifferent thoroughfare, was a lesson in abject powerlessness that no lecture could impart. This constant threat fostered a palpable atmosphere of fear and subservience. There was no recourse, no appeal. The Madame was judge, jury, and executioner, her decrees final and immediate. Her eyes missed nothing, scanning for any crack in the facade of compliance, any hint of independent thought. You learned to keep your gaze down, your voice soft, and your answers brief and agreeable. It was a meticulous performance of submission every day, every hour, a dance choreographed by desperation. For many, the instinct to survive quickly overshadowed any lingering desire for dignity or rebellion. The memory of a girl, perhaps named Marie, who had dared to argue about her share of earnings lingered in the air like a phantom. One moment her voice, albeit tremulous, was heard. The next, a terse command from the Madam, a rough shove, and Marie was simply gone, a fleeting cautionary tale whispered only in hushed tones, her shift a stark white against the grey morning as she disappeared from sight. Her crib, still smelling faintly of cheap perfume and stale tobacco, was occupied by a new face before nightfall. The Madame's control extended beyond just punishment for insubordination. It encompassed every aspect of a harlot's existence. From dictating the clothes you wore to the hours you worked to the prices you charged, she held the reins of your life tightly. It was a suffocating, almost invisible web spun from debt fear and the sheer lack of alternatives. The very food you ate, the roof over your head, the tattered dress on your back, all were contingent upon her whim, her profit margins. This system ensured perpetual indebtedness, making escape an almost insurmountable fantasy. Yet even as the Madame's watchful eye dominated the confined world of the crib, her power, formidable as it was, existed within a larger, more official framework of exploitation that loomed just beyond the threshold, often stepping over it with a heavy boot and an outstretched hand. The Madame's iron grip within the cribs, as absolute as it felt to those trapped under it, was merely one layer in the complex exploitative architecture of Storyville. Just beyond her immediate purview, or often right within, it law enforcement specifically, the constable functioned not as a protector of public order or a dispenser of justice, but as another insidious layer of the system designed for extraction and assertion of dominance. You'd come to recognize his heavy measured footsteps long before he appeared, the creak of his leather belt, the faint scent of stale pipe smoke that seemed to precede him. His rounds were not about maintaining peace. They were a performance, a ritualized collection of fees, a thinly veiled assertion of who held the true power in these shadowed streets. Imagine the scene: the constable, often a beefy man with a perpetually unimpressed expression, would sweep into the crib, his gaze sweeping over the women with an almost bored contempt. He wasn't there to investigate a crime or respond to a plea for help. No, his purpose was simpler, more direct: collect his due. This usually involved a quick, decisive slap of coins from a Madame's outstretched hand, a transaction that spoke volumes about the transactional nature of all relationships within this district. But his dominance wasn't just about money. It was also asserted through physical threats and the casual wielding of his authority. A bruising pinch to a chin, a sharp prod with his nightstick, or a subtly menacing stare would accompany his pronouncements, ensuring immediate subservience. It was a clear physical reminder of your place, a silent message that your body, your very person, was always subject to their will, and never truly your own. And should you ever dare to question this arrangement, or perhaps simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time, the constable had a favoured tool in his arsenal false charges: soliciting with impudence. He might declare, his voice dripping with feigned outrage, even if you'd simply been trying to get a breath of fresh air outside your stifling room. This vague catch-all accusation served multiple purposes. It was a convenient way to extract additional fines to justify a brief chilling stay in a local holding cell, or simply to reassert control over any woman who seemed a little too independent, a little too resilient. It was a potent psychological weapon, ensuring that you remained perpetually aware of the precariousness of your freedom, a freedom that could be snatched away on a whim without explanation or recourse. The sheer arbitrariness of it, the feeling that you were always one misinterpreted glance away from deeper trouble, contributed significantly to the pervasive sense of dread. The judicial system unfortunately offered no solace or protection whatsoever. You might imagine a formal courtroom, a robed judge, a chance to speak your truth. But that was a fantasy for another world. In Storyville, justice was a malleable concept, its scales perpetually tipped in favour of those with power and influence. Authority figures from the constables to the occasional low-level magistrate enforced rules only when it inconvenienced a man. If a client was angry, if a madam felt slighted, or if a powerful individual had a complaint, then and only then would the gears of justice begin to grind swiftly and mercilessly against the women. For the women themselves there was no protection from abuse, from exploitation, from the casual cruelty of clients, or the systemic indifference of officials. Your pleas would fall on deaf ears, your pain invisible, your existence dismissed. It was a brutal lesson in the utter vulnerability of your position, a quiet acceptance of the fact that your body, your suffering, was entirely your own burden, to be endured in silence, a burden that society itself had sanctioned. The chilling indifference of the judicial system, where your suffering was simply an unacknowledged burden, flowed seamlessly into another equally dehumanizing facet of life in Storyville: the mandatory medical inspections. These were not, you quickly learned, acts of genuine healthcare or concern for your well-being. Far from it. Instead, they served as a meticulously designed control mechanism, primarily put in place to protect the clients, reducing you to a mere biological conduit, a potential vector of contamination. Imagine being stripped of your personhood, your humanity, your very essence, and transformed in the eyes of the system into a tusk, a possible contamination source, a walking hazard. Every aspect of your being was suddenly reframed through the cold, clinical lens of public health, but a public health that cared only for one segment of the population. These inspections were regular, unannounced, and deeply invasive. There was no privacy, no dignity afforded. You were herded often with other women into crowded waiting areas, the air thick with apprehension, and the faint, unsettling scent of disinfectant. The process itself was a profound violation. You stood exposed under the unblinking gaze of a doctor whose demeanour was often one of detached professionalism bordering on contempt. Your body, which was already commodified in the cribs, was now further objectified, reduced to a collection of symptoms and potential risks. It was a stark reminder that even your physical integrity was not your own, but a public concern to be managed, controlled, and if necessary, quarantined, all for the benefit of others. The clinic itself, where these inspections took place, was a grim, unsanitary space. It wasn't a place of healing or comfort. Think of it as a sterile yet paradoxically grimy assembly line for bodies. The walls were often stained, the floors cold and hard, and the light, when it existed, was harsh and unforgiving. Privacy was a concept entirely absent. Examinations might occur behind thin, insufficient screens, or sometimes shockingly in full view of others waiting. Doctors, often overworked and desensitized, approached their task with a chilling indifference. Their prodding hands, their squinting eyes, their terse questions, all were focused solely on confirming a diagnosis, on identifying a contaminant. They would confirm a diagnosis of syphilis or gonorrhea, for instance, without ever truly acknowledging the person behind the condition, without making eye contact, without uttering a single word of comfort or explanation. You are not a patient suffering. You are a specimen, a data point in their ledgers, a problem to be solved, or more accurately, to be contained. This dehumanizing ritual stripped away layers of yourself, leaving you feeling exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. The very act of standing there enduring the cold instruments and the colder gazes chipped away at your spirit, reinforcing the message that your existence was merely conditional, your value purely transactional. It was a routine humiliation, a weekly or bi-weekly reminder that your body was a public utility, and its health was of concern only insofar as it impacted others. And should the dreaded diagnosis come, the consequences were far more terrifying than a mere visit to a clinic. The chilling indifference of the medical gaze which saw you as a hazard, rather than a human, escalated dramatically if an inspection confirmed illness. Failure of inspection meant a fate so profoundly dreaded, so utterly dehumanizing, that it haunted the waking thoughts and fleeting dreams of every woman in Storyville quarantine. This wasn't a restful recovery. It was a terrifying, isolating imprisonment within locked wards, a silent, unsanctioned death sentence in itself, designed to protect the public from your contaminated existence. You were simply removed, disappeared from the bustling life of the district, an inconvenience efficiently dealt with. Imagine these wards, stark, forbidding spaces often located on the upper floors of dilapidated buildings, or perhaps in a segregated wing of a public hospital. The windows were often sealed or painted over, or simply unopening, preventing any breath of fresh air, any glimpse of the vibrant city life you had left behind, however briefly. The air inside hung heavy and stagnant, thick with a pervasive scent of bleach and blood, a pungent chemical odour mingled with the metallic tang of human suffering, a smell that clung to your clothes and seeped into your very skin. It was a smell that spoke of sickness and sanitation attempts, of desperate measures, and the inescapable reality of bodily fluids, a constant assault on your senses. The beds themselves offered no comfort. They were often crudely constructed with thin straw mattresses that provided little cushioning, and the smell that permeated them, that lingering scent of bleach and blood, told a grim story of the many who had lain there before you, suffering, recovering, or more often simply succumbing. There was no privacy, no personal space. You were confined alongside other women, all sharing the same silent dread, the same pervasive stench, the same gnawing uncertainty. The days blurred into an indistinguishable cycle of monotonous meals, sporadic medical checks, and the constant crushing weight of confinement. A profound isolation that wore down the spirit as surely as disease wore down the body. This was not a place of compassionate care or genuine healing. It was a holding pen, a silent testament to societal abandonment. The fear of quarantine was so profound, so deeply ingrained, that for many the mere thought of it was enough to make them prefer a different, quieter end. The grim truth was that death in one's own bed was preferred to the dehumanizing ordeal of the quarantine ward. At least in your own bed, however stained and uncomfortable, you retained a vestige of agency, a fragile thread of control over your final moments. You might be surrounded by the familiar sounds of the crib, the distant music, the hushed conversations of the other girls. You might even have a small cherished object by your side. But in quarantine, even that small dignity was stripped away, replaced by the clinical coldness of institutional neglect. It was the ultimate erasure, a final act of removal from the world, even before the last breath was drawn. That clinical coldness of institutional neglect, a stark contrast to the small, fleeting dignity of a familiar bed, often extended far beyond the confines of the quarantine wards. For those diagnosed with rampant, pervasive diseases like syphilis, a ubiquitous spectre haunting the unlit corners of Storyville, the treatment itself frequently administered a different yet equally insidious kind of slow poison. This was medicine born of desperation and a rudimentary understanding of disease often more akin to a second medically sanctioned assault on your already struggling body. You might be prescribed mercury ointments, a thick, greasy paste to be rubbed into your skin, its metallic tang clinging to your fingers and the very air around you. Or perhaps the more severe and certainly more terrifying option of mercury injections delivered with crude, unsterilized needles that brought sharp, searing pain with each plunge. And then there were the tablets, bitter and acrid, leaving a metallic aftertaste that seemed to permanently coat your tongue, a constant reminder of the internal battle raging within. The devastating effects of these cures were often as crippling, if not more so, than the disease they were meant to combat. It was a cruel, ironic bargain trade, one form of suffering for another, perhaps even more grotesque. You would watch horrified as your hair began to fall out in clumps, leaving patches of scalp exposed, a visible testament to the poison coursing through your veins. Your teeth, once perhaps a small point of pride, would loosen, blacken, and eventually one by one begin to decay and fall out, leaving gaps that spoke volumes about your silent ordeal. Imagine the simple act of eating, once a basic necessity, becoming a painful, impossible task, further deepening the chronic hunger that already plagued your days. The mirror, if you dared to look, would reflect a stranger, a gaunt face, a receding hairline, a mouth hollowed by loss, your youth rapidly draining away with each passing day. Beyond the stark, physical changes, the mercury had a more insidious effect creeping into the very fabric of your mind. You might experience what were called small gaps in time, moments where clarity would blur, memories would become indistinct, and entire stretches of your day might simply vanish, leaving you disoriented and adrift. It was a terrifying erosion of your very self, a silent internal unravelling of identity. Your thoughts might become muddled, your emotions dulled, or perhaps conversely your temper would fray with unnerving ease. The lines between what was real and what was merely a mercury-induced hallucination began to blur. This cognitive decline, this quiet fraying of your mental faculties, made the already perilous daily existence even more fraught with danger. You were not only physically weakened but mentally compromised, making you an even easier target for exploitation, even more vulnerable to the machinations of those who controlled your world. This grim reality of treatment underscored the profound societal hypocrisy that underpinned Storyville. The very system that demanded your physical availability for consumption then subjected you to a cure that systematically destroyed your body and mind, all in the name of protecting those who exploited you. There was no real care, no genuine desire for your recovery, only a transactional calculation of risk versus profit. You were to be made safe for the next client, no matter the cost to your own decaying form. This brutal cycle of exploitation, disease, and toxic remedy ensured that your life was indeed a slow, drawn-out sentence, a continuous performance of submission, which, as we shall see, extended into every facet of your daily interactions, particularly with the ever-present enforcers of the district's grim order. The brutal cycle of exploitation, disease, and toxic remedy ensured that life in Storyville was a continuous performance of submission, a dance choreographed by power, which, as you might imagine, extended into every facet of your daily interactions. Nowhere was this more vividly, almost painfully illustrated than during the routine constable's rounds. These weren't mere patrols. They were rituals, a deliberate theatre of power and compliance played out under the indifferent gaze of the gas lamps. The constant gnawing threat of violence and arbitrary punishment was palpable, a silent hum in the air that you learn to live with like the pervasive humidity. Imagine the scene, the clatter of boots on cobblestones, the low murmur of voices, and then a sudden, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere of the crib. You'd feel it before you saw it. A tightening in your stomach, a quickening of your breath. The constable, often accompanied by another officer, would stride in his presence, immediately filling the cramped space demanding attention. He wouldn't necessarily say much at first, his eyes doing most of the talking, assessing, judging, establishing his dominion. His gaze would sweep across the women, lingering just long enough to instill a profound discomfort, a reminder that you were always under scrutiny, always on display, always accountable to his capricious authority. The core of these rounds, beyond the unspoken intimidation, was a chilling display of economic extraction. Money would change hands, of course, from the madam to the constable, a transaction that cemented the informal yet unbreakable alliance between those who controlled the women. But the performance of submission wasn't just financial, it was deeply physical and personal. You might witness or be subjected to a specific dehumanizing gesture. A coin, perhaps from a client's payment, would be slapped from a woman's hand, clattering onto the floor. This wasn't about the lost money, so much as the brutal assertion of ownership, the casual disregard for your meagre earnings, your desperate efforts to simply survive. You were not permitted to protest, not permitted to even flinch, lest you invite further more severe repercussions. And then there were the pinches. Not gentle, affectionate gestures, but bruising, deliberate pinches to the chin, delivered with a cold, almost surgical precision. This physical contact was designed not to inflict debilitating pain, but to enforce absolute subservience. It was a visceral reminder of your vulnerability, a non-verbal command demanding total compliance, absolute stillness, and a complete lack of resistance. The cold touch of his fingers, the pressure on your jaw, the forced upward tilt of your head, each element was a carefully calibrated tool to convey power and humiliation. You were expected to endure it without a sound, without a flicker of defiance in your eyes, a silent testament to your utter helplessness in the face of his authority. This casual public display of physical dominance vividly illustrated the daily constant performance of submission, where every touch, every glance, every silenced breath confirmed your place at the very bottom of Storyville's brutal hierarchy. It was a constant low-grade trauma, a testament to the unyielding power of the system to define control and ultimately erase your very existence, a process that extended far beyond these daily humiliations into the final, unnoticed moments of life itself. The quiet, systematic dehumanization from the physical assertions of power by the constable to the invasive medical inspections all culminated in a chilling, pervasive truth. The death sentence that hung over the harlots of Storyville was rarely a dramatic sudden event. It was not a sudden burst of violence in a dark alley, though that certainly happened, nor a swift terminal illness, though disease was rampant. Rather, it was a far more insidious, drawn-out process, a slow, systemic decline where life itself was worn thin, frayed at the edges by constant use and relentless pressure. Imagine a well-used garment, once vibrant, slowly losing its colour, its texture, its very integrity, until it simply became a shadow of its former self, barely holding together. Your body, the very instrument of your survival and your suffering, was the first to give way. It simply began to give out, not with a sudden collapse, but with a gradual, almost imperceptible weakening. A persistent cough that wouldn't clear a joint that ached relentlessly, even after a night's fitful sleep, a constant dull throb behind the eyes that no amount of rest could dispel. These were the early signs, the quiet whispers of a system that was slowly, methodically consuming you from the inside out. It was a deterioration fueled by malnutrition, by chronic infections, by the sheer physical and emotional toll of daily existence. You might try to ignore it, to push through the fatigue and the pain, but the body has its own unforgiving ledger, and eventually the debts come due. The chilling part, perhaps, was that this physical unravelling was often noticed by clients even before the individual themselves fully acknowledged it. A man who had paid for your company a week ago might return his gaze sharper, more discerning, and remark with a casual cruelty on your newfound pallor, the shadows beneath your eyes, or the tremor in your hand. "You look a bit peaked tonight, darling," he might say, or "lost some of your spark, haven't you?" Such comments, tossed off with a shrug, served as brutal external confirmations of an internal reality you were desperately trying to deny. They underscored your diminishing value in their transactional world, signalling that your usefulness, your brief season, was rapidly drawing to a close. This was a profound psychological blow, the ultimate objectification, or even your quiet internal decline was judged priced, and often discounted, a stark confirmation of your dwindling market value. This slow decay meant that death was not an unexpected visitor, but a familiar, albeit dreaded companion lurking just beyond the periphery of your vision. It was the logical conclusion to a life defined by consumption, by the constant erosion of self. There was no dramatic crescendo, no final battle against overwhelming odds. Instead, it was a quiet fading, a slow surrender to exhaustion and illness, a gentle easing out of a world that had never truly embraced you. The notion of dignity in such a life, let alone in such a death, seemed almost absurd, yet for some a flicker of that desire remained clinging to a desperate symbolic gesture against the ultimate erasure. That quiet fading, that slow surrender to exhaustion we touched upon, meant that the concept of dignity, especially in death, became a desperate, almost ephemeral aspiration. For most life had offered so little control, so few choices, that the very notion of orchestrating one's own final moments, however bleak, held a profound, almost spiritual significance. You see, when every day has been a compromise, a forced performance, a concession to the will of others, the idea of reclaiming even a sliver of agency in the ultimate act takes on monumental weight. It was a yearning that whispered in the dark corners of their minds a secret desire to exit on their own terms, rather than simply being consumed and discarded by the relentless machinery of Storyville. This yearning often manifested in surprisingly tangible ways, perhaps none more poignant than the quiet resolve of some to hold on to a dull and mostly symbolic knife. This wasn't a weapon of aggression, mind you, nor a tool for a dramatic escape. No, its blade, probably nicked and worn its handle smooth from countless nervous touches, served a far deeper purpose. It was an emblem, a silent promise to oneself, a final grim choice in a life otherwise devoid of them. Think of it as a small unyielding anchor in a sea of overwhelming forces. It represented a last-ditch effort to define the terms of one's own demise, to assert a final defiant no to the complete and utter obliteration of self. The underlying philosophy was stark born of bitter experience. They preferred to die with it in your hand than with someone's fingers around your throat. This wasn't merely a statement about physical strangulation, though certainly the threat of violence was ever present. It was a metaphor for the relentless choking of their autonomy, their spirit, their very identity. To die with the knife in hand was to choose a swift, self-determined end over a protracted, humiliating subjugation, whether at the hands of a brutal client, a punitive madam, or the slow, suffocating embrace of disease and institutional neglect. It was the ultimate, albeit tragic, assertion of self-possession, a silent scream of defiance against a world that sought to erase them completely. Imagine the desperation, the profound sense of hopelessness that would lead one to cherish such a choice. It wasn't about heroism. It was about the bare minimum of human dignity, the right to choose the manner of your final breath, even if the choice itself was agonizingly grim. You might not have spoken of this choice aloud to another soul, but the understanding was there, a quiet shared knowledge, among those who lived on the knife edge of existence. It was a testament to the fact that even in the most dehumanizing of circumstances, the human spirit instinctively yearns for some modicum of control, some final assertion of self. But this desperate aspiration for dignity for a chosen end was rarely fulfilled, or even acknowledged. The world of Storyville, ever pragmatic and indifferent, had little time or space for such personal tragedies. When the inevitable end finally came, as it always did, it was usually met with an utter lack of ceremony, a silent passing that was meticulously unrecorded, quietly unmourned and completely erased from the public consciousness, as if you had never truly existed at all. That quiet, unmourned passing, we just spoke of a stark reality in Storyville, was precisely why the inevitable end for these women was marked by an utter lack of ceremony or recognition. There were no hushed goodbyes, no solemn gatherings, no lingering moments of reflection. Your life, having been commodified and consumed, ended in the same cold, transactional manner. There was no priest to offer last rites, no spiritual comfort to ease the passage, no whispered prayers for a journey to a better place. The very concept of a soul or its salvation seemed an alien luxury in this realm of brutal practicality. You existed, you suffered, and then you simply ceased to be without the blessing or acknowledgement of any higher power. Equally absent was no doctor to declare the time. This might seem a minor detail, a bureaucratic oversight, but its absence spoke volumes. A doctor's declaration even today marks a formal end, a medical acknowledgement of life's cessation. Here there was no such formality, no professional witness to your final breath. You simply faded perhaps in the quiet hours of the early morning, unnoticed by the madam or the other girls, until a later, more convenient moment. Your passing was not an event to be recorded with precision, but an inconvenience to be managed, a space to be filled, a problem to be disposed of. The lack of a medical authority to officially mark your time of death further underscored the profound societal indifference, a silent declaration that your life in its entirety was deemed unworthy of even this most basic administrative recognition. Instead of a name, a time, a eulogy, your final public record would likely be nothing more than a chillingly anonymous coroner's office entry. Female mid-20s to early 30s unclaimed. Imagine the stark brutality of that notation. Your age a rough estimate, implying a life cut brutally short, yet also a life already worn beyond its years. And then the ultimate erasure unclaimed. No family to come forward, no friend to inquire, no one to mourn your absence, to acknowledge your unique existence. It was the final, definitive statement of your isolation, a testament to the profound societal abandonment that had defined your life from the moment you entered the district's grasp. You were a nameless, faceless entity, a statistic, a forgotten shadow in the vibrant, bustling tableau of New Orleans. This impersonal disposal extended immediately to your few meagre possessions. There was no time for sentimentality, no quiet sorting of cherished belongings. They were swiftly scavenged, either by the madam, ever pragmatic and alert to new opportunities for profit, or by the other girls. Perhaps a slightly less tattered shift, a pair of worn shoes, a broken comb, a faded ribbon. Each item, however small, was immediately recycled, repurposed, absorbed back into the grim economy of the cribs. It was a stark, almost brutal illustration of the transactional nature of their lives, where even in death your paltry possessions were instantly repurposed to extend the fleeting survival of another. This rapid scavenging served as a visual reminder that everything, even your final vestiges of identity, held a transactional value, reinforcing the brutal truth that nothing, not even your personal effects, was truly your own. The efficient, almost brutal disposal of your belongings mirrored the final, ignominious journey of your body, a journey that further emphasized the profound, systemic erasure of your existence. That rapid scavenging of meagre possessions, a stark illustration of transactional existence even in death, flowed seamlessly into the ultimate act of erasure, the disposal of the body itself. There was no reverence, no solemn procession, no final farewell. Your physical remains, having served their purpose and then ceased to function, were treated with the same cold pragmatism as any other discarded object in the district. They were simply moved in a wagon used for hauling refuse and broken furniture. Imagine the indignity your body, once the vessel of your struggles, your fleeting joys, your relentless pain now lumped unceremoniously with splintered chairs and forgotten junk. The rumble of the wagon's wheels on the cobblestones would have been the only soundtrack to this final journey, a sound that blended seamlessly with the everyday noises of the city, utterly unremarkable. This humble, unceremonious conveyance had a singular destination, a city lot where the grass grows patchy, and the graves are marked with numbers instead of names. Picture it a forgotten patch of land, perhaps on the outskirts of the district, or a pauper's field near the river where the earth was uneven and the vegetation sparse, struggling to take root in soil that perhaps held too many silent stories. There were no graceful headstones, no carved angels, no personal inscriptions reflecting a life lived, a love lost, or a dream unfulfilled. Instead, you would find crude wooden markers, or perhaps simply stones bearing nothing more than a number. A chilling, impersonal tally in the silent ledger of the forgotten dead. Your unique identity, your name, your story, all were stripped away, replaced by a cold numerical designation. It was the ultimate anonymity, a final chilling punctuation mark on a life already rendered invisible. The absence of any public acknowledgement further underscored the complete societal erasure of these lives. There were no headlines, screaming of tragedy, no sensationalized stories of a life cut short. Your passing would not merit a single column inch in the local newspaper, not even a fleeting mention in the crime blotter. There were no obituaries to mark your birth, your life, or your death. No public record of your journey through this world. And perhaps most poignantly, there wasn't a single mourner standing by the freshly turned earth, shedding a tear, offering a final whispered goodbye, or holding a memory. Your existence had been, for all intents and purposes, a silent shadow, and your departure was equally silent, equally unacknowledged by the bustling world around you. The district, in its relentless pursuit of profit and pleasure, seamlessly continued its operations, as if nothing had happened. The music still spilled from the parlour houses, the laughter still echoed from the saloons, the commerce of bodies and fleeting pleasures still churned on. Your crib, after a brief perfunctory cleaning, would soon be occupied by another young woman, fresh-faced, and perhaps still clinging to a thread of hope, unaware that she was stepping into a role already pre-written, a sentence already delivered. Already. Your life, your struggles, your pain, your very death, all were but a fleeting ripple on the surface of Storyville's turbulent waters, quickly smoothed over, leaving no trace. This profound societal amnesia, this institutional forgetting, was perhaps the cruelest aspect of your death sentence, for it denied you not just a dignified end, but even the barest recognition of your having existed at all. That heavy blanket of collective amnesia, which quickly swallowed the memory of those who succumbed, left those who remained to face the relentless everyday companion of physical suffering. This was not the fleeting pain of an injury, but a continuous pervasive torment that seeped into every bone and fibre of your being, creating a perpetual state of discontent. Your aching thighs perpetually sore from endless standing, and the physical demands of your trade were a constant throbbing reminder of your commodified body. Imagine the deep bruised ache that never quite dissipated even after a night's fitful shallow sleep. Then there was the spinning head, a common affliction brought on by malnutrition, exhaustion, and perhaps the early stages of illness. It was a dizzying, disorienting sensation that made the world tilt and sway, blurring the edges of an already harsh reality. This constant internal disequilibrium could make simple tasks feel like monumental challenges, and every movement a precarious negotiation with gravity. Compounding this physical misery was the gnawing hunger, a dull, insistent ache in your stomach that never truly went away. It wasn't just the sharp pangs of missing a meal. It was a chronic underlying emptiness that drained your energy and frayed your nerves, making everything feel just a little bit harder, a little bit heavier. And finally, the omnipresent shadow of chronic illness. Beyond the dreaded syphilis, there were persistent coughs, that racked your body fevers that burned with an invisible fire, and a myriad of other nameless ailments that slowly, systematically eroded your health. These were not conditions that offered the luxury of a definitive diagnosis or a proper cure. They were simply part of the fabric of your existence, another layer of discomfort you learned to live with. This unceasing assault on your body and spirit naturally created a profound, pervasive state of discontent. You were never truly comfortable, never truly at ease. Every moment was a battle against your own weakening physical form, a silent plea for respite that rarely came. Yet despite this profound and widespread suffering, this pervasive discontent rarely expressed itself as collective rebellion. You might wonder why, given the shared misery, there wasn't a stronger unified uprising. But the truth was far more complex and far more grim. The system was designed to isolate, to atomize, to prevent the very solidarity that might fuel such a movement. Each woman was too consumed by her own immediate battle for survival, too wary of drawing attention, too terrified of the swift, brutal repercussions that awaited any act of overt defiance. The madam's absolute authority, the constable's casual cruelty, the indifference of the law, these were potent deterrents constantly reinforcing the futility of collective action. So the discontent simmered beneath the surface, a quiet individual burning, rarely erupting into open flame. That simmering, unexpressed discontent we just described, a quiet internal fire rarely given leave to blaze into collective rebellion, meant that most responses to suffering in Storyville were individual acts of self-preservation or defiance. These were not grand gestures, mind you, but small, often desperate attempts to reclaim a sliver of agency in a world utterly dedicated to stripping it away. You might have seen or perhaps attempted yourself the most immediate and instinctive form of resistance, trying to run away. The thought would bloom in your mind like a fragile forbidden flower, a train ticket, a distant relative, a new city where no one knew your name. The sheer allure of escaping the suffocating confines of the crib, of breathing truly free air, was a powerful, almost intoxicating dream. But these attempts, fueled by a potent cocktail of desperation and fleeting hope, were almost always swiftly and brutally suppressed. The district had its own informal but highly effective network of eyes and ears. A madam's stern warning to local watchmen, a constable's casual observation, or even the betrayal of a fellow desperate soul could bring your fragile escape to a crashing halt. Imagine the dread of being caught, the sudden rough hand on your arm, the chilling, knowing smile of the officer as he escorted you back to the very place you longed to flee. The consequences were designed to be immediate, painful, and deeply discouraging. A severe beating, a stint in the unsanitary jail, or a more subtle yet equally terrifying increase in your debt to the madam, these were the lessons learned, carved into your very flesh and spirit. Such brutal suppression served a clear purpose to teach with chilling clarity that any resistance, any deviation from your prescribed path carried severe, often fatal consequences. The walls of your cage, you quickly understood, were not just physical, they were psychological, reinforced by pain and the crushing weight of futility. In the face of such overwhelming power, the women developed more subtle, insidious tricks for managing violent or difficult clients. These were not acts of defiance, but rather intricate, delicate ballets of self-preservation, honed by necessity and shared experience. You might learn to fake a sudden cough, a dry, racking sound designed to create a moment of distraction, a brief lull in a client's aggression, allowing you a fleeting opportunity to shift position or escape a particularly dangerous hold. Or perhaps a more disarming tactic, complimenting a man's hands, a small, unexpected observation, delivered in a soft, non-threatening tone. "My, you have strong hands, sir," you might murmur, hoping to appeal to a flicker of vanity to redirect his focus to perhaps elicit a moment of human connection that might lessen the immediate threat. This delicate balance of flattery and feigned frailty illustrated the complex, precarious strategies for survival that permeated every interaction. You were constantly calculating, assessing, adapting, trying to predict the unpredictable and to mitigate the inevitable. It was a tiring, emotionally draining performance, a constant tightrope walk between compliance and quiet resistance, between survival and succumbing to the overwhelming forces that sought to crush your spirit. These subtle tactics were your only weapons in a world that denied you any real power, a stark testament to the profound need for ingenuity when open defiance was suicidal. And yet even these small victories often led to another more insidious chain, the increasing reliance on substances to numb the overwhelming weight of their reality. The lingering scent of cheap perfume and stale tobacco, often clinging to the fabric of your worn dress, soon mingled with another more potent aroma in the quiet hours of the crib. The sweet, acrid scent of dust or opium, which offered a fleeting, seductive promise of escape from the unyielding weight of that very reality. For many, after the endless parade of demanding clients, the gnawing hunger and the persistent ache in every bone, this powdered oblivion became less a choice and more a desperate necessity. It offered a temporary bitter relief, a brief reprieve from the relentless physical and emotional pain that was your constant companion. You might find yourself seeking out the pipe, its bowl glowing red in the dim light, the first drag filling your lungs with a thick, dreamlike smoke. For a precious few moments the world would soften its harsh edges, blurring the clamour of the streets, fading to a distant murmur. Imagine the quiet desperation that would lead you to seek solace in such a fragile, dangerous embrace. The nagging aches in your thighs, the dull throb behind your eyes, the constant fear of disease and violence, all could for a precious interval be muted. Your mind, perpetually racing with calculations of survival, could finally blissfully slow its spin, perhaps even drift into a state of hazy, comforting detachment. It was a self-administered balm for a soul worn raw by relentless exposure. The sharp pangs of hunger might recede, the memory of a violent client might dim, and the crushing weight of hopelessness might lift, if only for an hour or two. This temporary oblivion, however illusory, was a powerful lure, a siren song promising quietude in a world of constant noise and demands. However, as with most things that offer quick fixes in Storyville, this relief came at a profound, often devastating cost. The dust was not merely a temporary escape, it swiftly became another more insidious chain binding you tighter to the very existence you sought to flee. First there was the financial cost. Every small amount of opium purchase meant less money for food, less for rent, less for the elusive dream of saving enough to perhaps, just perhaps, buy your freedom. You quickly found yourself in a deeper, more entrenched debt, not just to the madam, but now to the shadowy figures who supplied the drug. It was a vicious cycle. The more pain you endured, the more you sought the relief. The more relief you sought, the deeper your debt and the more vulnerable you became. Beyond the financial trap, the physical toll of addiction was equally merciless. The initial relief gave way to a deeper physical deterioration, constipation, lethargy, a weakened immune system. The symptoms of opium addiction mirrored and exacerbated the very illnesses that already plagued the women, making them even more susceptible to the prevalent diseases of the district. Your eyes might become sunken, your skin sallow, further reducing your already precarious value in the eyes of clients. Mentally, the gaps in time would grow, your judgment would become clouded, and the quick wit needed for self-preservation might dull. This made you an easier target for exploitation, less able to employ the tricks that once offered a semblance of safety, more prone to falls and accidents. The drug and its cruel irony stripped away the very resilience it initially seemed to provide, leaving you more exposed, more vulnerable, and utterly dependent. It was a different kind of imprisonment, perhaps less visible than a locked room, but no less binding an internal cage where the bars were forged from your own desperation, and the fading light of hope, a shared, silent ritual that would often foster a fragile network among those who understood its bitter promise. That bitter promise of shared oblivion, the silent internal cage forged from desperation, often fostered a fragile and unspoken network among the girls of Storyville. It was a peculiar kind of camaraderie born not of overt affection or shared confidences, but of the shared filth and the common struggle. Imagine the pervasive stench of sweat, cheap perfume and decay that clung to everything, a communal miasma that bound them together in a strange, unacknowledged intimacy. This was a filth that went beyond mere physical grime. It was the moral stain, the societal judgment, the collective degradation they all bore, a heavy shroud that separated them from the respectable world. This shared burden of being deemed unclean, of existing at the very bottom of society's barrel, created a silent, unspoken understanding among them. There were no long conversations about their pasts, no emotional disclosures of their dreams or fears. Such luxuries were dangerous, leading to caring, which, as we've noted before, was a distinct liability in this brutal environment. Instead, their understanding manifested in quiet glances, a knowing nod when a client was particularly difficult, a shared sigh of exhaustion as the sun began to rise. It was a connection born of mutual recognition of a fate, an unspoken agreement that they were all in this impossible situation together, however separately they endured it. You could see it in the way a girl might subtly shift her weight in line at the communal basin, allowing another to get a clearer spot or a flicker of empathy in her eyes when she saw a fresh bruise on a sister's arm. This fragile network rarely, if ever, coalesced into overt defiance. The risks were simply too high, the individual struggle too overwhelming. Revolution, or even organised protest, was a concept entirely alien to their day-to-day existence. However, this unspoken bond did manifest in a practical utilitarian way, as a subtle, almost invisible system for trading small necessities. A shared cigarette passed from hand to hand in a sliver of shade. A hairpin quietly offered when a knot in another's hair seemed insurmountable. A stolen shard of soap split into meagre portions. These were the currency of their quiet compassion, the small acts of solidarity that eased the relentless grind if only for a moment. They were not about grand gestures of friendship, but about mutual survival, a silent acknowledgement that a small act of kindness exchanged without expectation could make the difference between a slightly more tolerable day and one of sheer unendurable misery. This delicate balance between self-preservation and a fragile, almost unconscious communal support system was constantly challenged by the brutal realities of Storyville. Any act that threatened the established order, even an individual one, was met with swift and decisive force, serving as a chilling reminder of the futility of resistance. Consider the story of the girl who slashed a man across the cheek after he tried to strangle her. This wasn't a planned act of vengeance, but a desperate instinctual lashing out, a moment of raw primal self-defense against an immediate threat. Imagine the fear, the adrenaline, the sheer audacity of striking back in a world where you were expected to endure. However, the immediate aftermath underscored the profound power imbalance. Her act, while understandable, was not met with justice or protection. The man, almost certainly well connected, would have immediately leveraged his influence, and so the girl had to leave town the next day due to his connections with the constabulary. She wasn't fleeing justice, but escaping a retribution that would have been far more severe and final than any legal consequence. This incident, whispered among the girls as a cautionary tale, vividly illustrated the absolute futility of individual resistance against the systemic power structure. It cemented the bitter truth that even a justified act of self-defense could be weaponized against you, forcing you further into the shadows or worse, into an unknown dangerous future. Such was the pervasive grip of the system, a grip that shaped not just your daily experience, but the very foundational realities of your existence, defining who you were allowed to be and to whom. That pervasive grip of the system, shaping every desperate breath and whispered act of survival, was underpinned by a stark set of foundational realities structuring every single aspect of a harlot's existence in 1890s New Orleans. These were not mere circumstances. They were the very bedrock upon which their precarious lives were built, defining not just their daily torment, but the inevitable end that awaited them. First among these, and perhaps most insidious, was the inescapable social hierarchy, a towering invisible wall that rendered them both visible in their commodified role and utterly invisible as human beings. A harlot's identity, you see, was never truly her own. It was a fluid, externally imposed construct, shifting and conforming to the demands of the market and the whims of those who controlled it. Your name changes depending on who's paying, a brutal truth that stripped away personal history and individual recognition. One client might call you Angel, another Belle, still another simply Girl. Each appellation a temporary label applied to a temporary service, never acknowledging the complex individual beneath. Your very essence was dissolved into a series of roles, a performance for others, leaving no room for a stable, authentic self. And as if that weren't enough, your worth changes depending on how sick you look that day. Imagine the terror of waking up with a visible rash, a persistent cough, or a fever, knowing that your physical appearance directly correlated with your economic viability. Your value plummeted, your ability to earn diminished, making the constant battle for survival even more desperate. This stark reality reflected an absolute chilling lack of personal agency, a fundamental denial of your right to define yourself or control your own destiny. Society at large, the polite, respectable world beyond the gaslit alleys of Storyville, actively participated in this erasure. It wasn't a passive oversight. It was a deliberate act of collective forgetting, a conscious decision to consign these women to invisibility. "No one writes novels about your kind," was a bitter truth that echoed in the silence of their lives. Their stories, filled with more drama, more despair, more raw humanity than any fictional narrative, were deemed unworthy of preservation, unfit for public consumption. And certainly no one carves your name in stone. Their very existence was ephemeral, unrecorded, their memories left to crumble into dust, unlike the grand monuments and meticulously catalogued lives of the city's more prominent citizens. This deliberate historical amnesia ensured that their suffering remained confined to the shadows, out of sight, out of mind, and crucially out of public conscience. The sharp social divide was painfully evident in the stark contrast between the velvet-draped kind in the fancy bordellos of Mahogany Hall and the kind who wakes up on a stained mattress in a crib. While both groups were engaged in the same profession, the former enjoyed a semblance of luxury, a thin veneer of respectability, their rooms perhaps smelling of expensive perfume and fresh linen. Mahogany Hall, a name that shimmered with an almost mythical allure, represented a world of unattainable comfort, a world where the commodification of intimacy was perhaps less raw, more subtly veiled. But for the women of the cribs there was no such illusion. Their reality was the stained mattress, the pervasive stench, the ever-present threat of eviction. This stark dichotomy highlighted their absolute bottom-rung status, a powerful reminder that even among the marginalised there were layers of despair, and they occupied the very lowest. This pervasive stratification, where even a fleeting glimpse of a perceived higher status could bring a pang of recognition, rather than jealousy, truly emphasised the grim, constrained possibilities of their lives. That pervasive stratification, where even a fleeting glimpse of a perceived higher status brought a pang of recognition rather than pure jealousy, was a constant, subtle torment. Imagine the crisp rustle of silk, the faint scent of a different, more expensive perfume, as girls from Mahogany Hall occasionally passed by. They moved with an almost ethereal grace, often shielded by parasol and clean gloves, their faces veiled, their gazes perhaps distant. It was a fleeting glimpse of an unattainable could-have-been you, a painful whisper of an alternative reality that was always just beyond reach. You knew deep in your bones that this was a world you would never truly enter, a life that would never be yours, a stark contrast to the gritty, unyielding reality of your own stained mattress and aching bones. These encounters, brief as they were, served as a potent, bitter reminder of the invisible boundaries that defined your existence. They were a visual manifestation of the vast chasm between the illusion of comfort and the reality of your despair. You might catch a glimpse of a woman whose youth seemed less worn, whose eyes held a faint spark of hope that had long since extinguished in your own. The parasol, a seemingly innocuous accessory, became a symbol of protection, of leisure, of a world where one could afford to shield oneself from the harsh glare of the sun, and by extension from the harsh realities of life. And the clean gloves, a small detail perhaps, but one that spoke volumes about a life unmarred by the grime and filth of constant labour, untouched by the raw realities of survival. This was a world of privilege, a world of choice, a world utterly alien to yours. And then beyond the confines of Storyville, beyond even the velvet-draped windows of Mahogany Hall, lay the world of the good girls of New Orleans. These were the women who occupied the shaded porches of grand houses in the Garden District, their laughter light and unrestrained, their conversations likely revolving around social calls and garden parties. Imagine them serenely sipping tea, their lives untouched by the brutal necessities that dictated your every breath. They served as a constant, painful reminder of a world of comfort, of respectability, of genuine affection and security, a world entirely beyond reach, a cruel mirage. You might catch a fleeting glimpse of them on a rare trip outside the district, perhaps, when fetching water, or running a desperate errand for the madam. Their effortless elegance, their clear, untroubled eyes would sting with the bitter knowledge of what you had lost, or perhaps what you had never had the chance to possess. This stark social stratification from the unattainable luxury of Mahogany Hall to the quiet domesticity of the good girls created a pervasive sense of exclusion, of being permanently exiled from the world of normalcy and dignity. It was a profound psychological burden, reinforcing the message that your life, however human, its struggles, was considered an aberration, a discarded fragment of society. This emotional landscape of envy and resignation was perhaps best captured in a fleeting internal moment. The moment of recognition from a passing Mahogany Hall girl, feeling the heat of it behind your eyes, not jealousy, but recognition that could have been you, underlines the pervasive social stratification and the limited, grim possibilities of their lives. It wasn't a bitter resentment, not a burning envy for their specific luxuries. It was a deeper, more profound pang, the recognition of a shared vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement that fate, or a series of cruel circumstances, had simply placed her on a slightly less brutal path within the same inescapable system. This profound, quiet understanding of shared, grim possibilities then leads us to the core economic reality that dictated every single aspect of their daily struggle: the cold, mercenary exchange of body for survival. That profound, quiet understanding of shared, grim possibilities of lives shaped by arbitrary circumstance brought us inexorably to the very core of a harlot's existence in Storyville, the fundamental economic reality that drove every beat of her heart and every weary step. This was not a nuanced system of commerce, but a direct, brutal commodification of the human body. Your identity, your spirit, your very being were reduced to a series of transactions, a raw calculation of physical output against the most basic, often unmet needs. You were quite simply selling your body for coins, your time for crumbs. Imagine the daily degradation of this exchange, where your intimate self was bartered for the bare minimum of sustenance, your precious hours traded for fleeting, insufficient remuneration. The income itself was perpetually meagre and astonishingly precarious. You might end a night after countless difficult encounters with 3 coins, a broken brooch, and a button. Think about that for a moment. 3 small coins, barely enough for a single meagre meal, perhaps not even that. The broken brooch, a discarded trinket from a client, held no real value, only a faint, sad echo of what might have once been considered a gift. And a button, a stray, useless item, a stark symbol of the utter worthlessness of so much of what you received. This pitiful collection was perpetually insufficient for rent, for food, for any semblance of a decent existence. It ensured a constant state of debt and desperation, a perpetual chase after a bare minimum that always remained just out of reach like a mirage in the sweltering heat. The Madam Ever the Astute businesswoman was the ultimate gatekeeper of these meagre earnings, ensuring perpetual indebtedness and preventing any accumulation of savings or heaven, forbid a means of escape. She controlled earnings through a complex web of overcharges and deductions. The very roof over your head, the thin mattress you slept on, the tattered shift you wore, the meagre, often unpalatable food you ate, all were provided at exorbitant rates, cleverly structured to ensure that your debt to her never truly diminished. There were charges for rent, for meals, for lamp oil, for the minimal laundry service, for any perceived infraction. Each transaction was a meticulously crafted trap, designed to keep you beholden to her, to extinguish any flicker of hope for financial independence. You were a perpetual debtor, forever chasing a horizon that receded with every coin earned. This pervasive debt extended beyond the madam, trapping the women in a complex, dehumanizing web of obligations. You might find yourself owing the butcher's boy a meal for a scrap of meat, or the bottle man a favour for a swig of illicit liquor. These were not just minor debts, they were new chains binding you to a shadowy network of informal creditors, further diminishing your autonomy and deepening your vulnerability. Each favour owed, each small debt accumulated, was another chip away at your already fragile independence. Another thread added to the intricate tapestry of exploitation that defined your life. It was a constant low-level anxiety, a pervasive awareness that you were always beholden, always owing, never truly free. Perhaps most chillingly, the value of a harlot was directly tied to her physical condition, and the client's preference perverting the very concept of worth. Men who paid to inflict pain often paid, well, a perverse incentive that sanctioned and even rewarded cruelty. Imagine the grim calculus, your suffering, your humiliation, becoming a commodity that fetched a higher price. Conversely, ailing women received discounts, their declining health transforming them into a less valuable, less desirable product. This utterly stripped away any intrinsic worth, reducing human beings to damaged goods, their price dictated by their ability to endure or entertain a client's darkest desires. This brutal economic reality was perhaps best encapsulated by a small hidden collection of futility. That brutal economic reality where even your suffering had a price tag found a silent, poignant monument tucked away in the shadows of the crib. Imagine a loose floorboard, perhaps near a creaking wall, a small hidden space that served as a secret vault for desperate hopes and shattered dreams. Here you might find a small graveyard of false promises and vanished men, a collection of wooden painted silver fake coins. These weren't actual currency, of course, but crude imitations passed off by dishonest clients, or those simply too drunk to notice the deception. Each one represented a transaction, a service rendered for which no true payment was received. Think of the bitter sting of discovering such a coin. The quick, nervous bite to test its metallic ring, followed by the crushing realization that it was nothing but a worthless piece of wood painted to deceive. The momentary flicker of hope that you might finally have enough for a real meal, a small luxury, or even just to pay down a sliver of your insurmountable debt extinguished in an instant. This collection, growing steadily over weeks or months, served as a stark, tangible illustration of the perpetual economic deception that permeated your life. Every fake coin was a betrayal, a further erosion of trust, a chilling reminder that even in your most basic transactions you were constantly being cheated. constantly being devalued. It was a silent testament to the futility of your labour, a grim accumulation of wasted effort and unfulfilled promises. These fake coins weren't just about financial loss. They were psychological warfare chipping away at your spirit, fostering a deep-seated cynicism. You learned to be suspicious, to be wary, to trust no one, not even the most seemingly innocuous exchange. It added another layer of weariness to an already exhausting existence. Each time you handled a coin, you'd quickly, almost instinctively test its weight, its sound, its texture, a learned defense mechanism against the pervasive dishonesty. This constant vigilance drained your energy, transforming even the simplest acts into moments of quiet tension. Beyond the man-made cruelties and economic exploitations, the environment itself of 1890s New Orleans, its very climate and natural conditions conspired with these forces becoming a relentless opponent in its own right. Imagine the oppressive humidity that was not just a nuisance but a constant physical torment. It clung to your skin like a wet rag, a suffocating, inescapable presence that permeated every fibre of your clothing, every breath you took. This was not a pleasant tropical warmth, but a heavy, enervating dampness that made even the simplest movement feel like a Herculean effort. It fostered a pervasive stickiness, a constant sheen of sweat and discomfort, and contributed to the rapid spread of mildew and rot, not just on the walls of your crib, but subtly, insidiously within your very being. It was a constant physical assault accelerating the deterioration of your body and spirit. This unrelenting natural adversary was as much a part of your daily struggle as any human antagonist. That relentless humidity clinging to your skin like a wet rag and permeating everything was merely one facet of a larger, more pervasive adversary, the utter lack of sanitation. It was a condition that transcended mere discomfort, transforming your living space into an atmosphere of inescapable decay, a sensory assault that you learned by grim necessity to simply endure. Imagine stepping into your room, or indeed any room in your immediate vicinity, and having the air itself feel thick and heavy with the pervasive stench of human waste. The sharp, acrid tang of piss, mixed with the cloying sweetness of old perfume, a desperate attempt to mask the underlying reality, creating a nauseating, paradoxical bouquet. Then, overlaying it all, the undeniable odour of sweat, a constant reminder of the physical exertion and the oppressive heat. But it was the deeper, more unsettling notes that truly defined the atmosphere, the sweet, sick rot of whatever died behind the wallboards. This wasn't a fleeting smell. It was a permanent fixture, an invisible occupant in your shared space. Perhaps a rat or some other unfortunate creature had found its final resting place within the very structure of your temporary home, its slow decomposition adding to the pervasive miasma. This particular scent carried a psychological weight, a constant subtle reminder of mortality and decay, whispering of lives and organisms ending all around you, unnoticed and unmourned. You learn to filter it out, to build an almost impenetrable mental barrier against the assault on your senses, but it was always there, a low background hum of putrefaction that permeated your clothes, your hair, your very skin, clinging to you long after you had left the confines of your room. This omnipresent stench wasn't just unpleasant. It was a constant reminder of the profound neglect and the complete absence of any meaningful hygiene infrastructure. There were no proper sewage systems, no regular waste disposal that reached the fringes of the district with any efficiency. Every bodily function, every discarded scrap contributed to this suffocating atmosphere. It meant that even the simple act of breathing became a compromise, an inhalation of particles and odours that subtly eroded your health and your sense of well-being. Your lungs, perpetually exposed to this toxic air, bore the brunt of this environmental assault, making you more susceptible to respiratory ailments and generally weakening your constitution. It created a profound sense of helplessness, a feeling that no matter how much you scrubbed your own skin, how much you tried to air out your tiny room, you could never truly escape the pervasive contamination. The decay was inherent to the very structure of your existence here, a fundamental component of the environment you were forced to inhabit. And while the smells were a constant, undeniable presence, they were far from the only, or even the most insidious evidence of the pervasive uncleanliness. The silent creeping movement of unseen creatures and the dangerous necessity of finding water provided other more visceral reminders of the precariousness of your very physical being. That pervasive, inescapable stench of decay and neglect, a constant reminder of the profound uncleanliness, was only one layer of the environmental adversary you faced daily. Beneath the surface of the putrid air and crumbling wallboards, life in Storyville teemed with other less visible yet equally insidious threats. Imagine the soft, unsettling rustle near your ankles as you moved through the cramped spaces of your crib or ventured into the dimly lit alleyways. This was the common ignored reality of rats, their silent darting movements a testament to the thriving vermin population. They were not merely a nuisance, they were carriers of disease, their presence a constant low-level threat. That you simply learned to coexist with a testament to the sheer exhaustion and indifference born of enduring such pervasive squalor. The water, a fundamental necessity for life, was another perilous negotiation. Clean water was a luxury rarely afforded. Instead, your desperate thirst or the need for a rudimentary wash often led you to communal basins that were perpetually chipped and ringed with old scum, or to horse troughs near the alley's edge. This was water teeming with unseen life, contaminated by the runoff of the streets, by the waste of animals, by the careless hands of dozens who had used it before you. Drinking from such sources was a dangerous gamble, a silent game of chance with every sip. Every time you scooped water, you knew you were potentially inviting a host of ailments into your already fragile body, from dysentery to more insidious unseen infections. It was a cruel irony. The very substance meant to sustain life became a potent vector of disease, highlighting the pervasive uncleanliness and the constant, inescapable threat of infection that defined your daily struggle. And indeed, disease itself was not just a possibility. It was an ever-present systemic threat, an invisible force actively eroding your health with relentless efficiency. From the mundane yet debilitating pervasive sores and rashes that never quite healed to the dreaded syphilis that ravaged your body from the inside out, illness was a constant companion. Your body was a battleground, constantly fighting off assaults from infected water, unhygienic conditions, and the rampant transmission of sexually transmitted diseases. This wasn't an occasional sickness. It was a chronic state of being a slow, debilitating death sentence administered by microscopic agents. You might wake with new lesions, your skin perpetually itchy and inflamed, or feel the dull ache of an internal infection you couldn't name but whose presence was undeniable. The very air, it seemed, felt thicker somehow, like disease itself is floating through the heat. This was not just a poetic turn of phrase. It was a felt reality, a pervasive sense that the atmosphere itself was laden with pathogens, an invisible enemy that contributed to the rapid physical decline of the women. The oppressive humidity, instead of feeling cleansing, felt like it was holding the sickness close, allowing it to seep into every pore. It was a constant, pervasive enemy that contributed to the rapid physical decline of the women, making survival a race against internal rot. Every breath, every sip of water, every intimate contact was a gamble with your health, a silent acknowledgement that your body was slowly, inexorably betraying you, crumbling under the weight of an environment designed to consume rather than sustain, bringing us to the very personal experience of that suffocating environment. That pervasive consuming environment, so adept at eroding health and spirit from the outside, and found its most intimate, most immediate expression within the four walls you called home. For the harlots of Storyville daily existence was less a series of events and more a raw, unfiltered sensory experience of discomfort and struggle. It was a constant personal battle against the forces that sought to strip away every last vestige of comfort and hope, accelerating the quiet, relentless death sentence they silently bore. And this battle, you might be surprised to learn, began the very moment your eyes fluttered open. Waking in a crib meant inhaling an air that clung to you not just figuratively but physically like a wet rag. It was thick, sour air, a palpable weight that pressed down on your chest heavy, with the pervasive stench of piss-sweat old perfume and the sweet, sick rot of whatever died behind the wallboards. Imagine trying to take a deep breath only for your lungs to be assaulted by this suffocating mixture, a perpetual reminder of your grim surroundings. It wasn't the kind of scent that faded. It permeated your clothes, your hair, your very skin, a chemical signature of your existence stubbornly clinging long after you stepped outside. This wasn't merely an unpleasant aroma. It was an invisible wall, a constant low-grade assault that mirrored the broader indignities of your life, making the simple act of breathing a conscious effort. As you tried to push away the heavy sleep your body would protest, the effort to simply sit up was often marked by a lurching stomach, a wave of dizziness and a traitorous pop in your knee, a sound all too familiar to joints perpetually strained and poorly nourished. Then came the immediate sensation of a cold, sticky floor beneath your bare feet, a grim welcome to another day. The mattress beneath you, thin and collapsing, offered no solace. It was universally soaked through, not just from the oppressive humidity that seemed to permeate every fibre of the city, but from the sweat of countless clients, from spilled drinks, and perhaps from your own quiet tears or sick spells. The sheets, if they could be called that, were perpetually sticking to your skin, coated with a film of various bodily fluids, and yet you learned to ignore it. This wasn't a choice born of stubbornness, but of sheer overwhelming exhaustion and a chilling indifference that was a necessary armour against the ceaseless assault on your senses. The crib itself was a microcosm of neglect and decay. Rats rustling near your ankles were a common ignored reality, their scuttling movements blending into the background noise of the night. You'd ceased to flinch your capacity for shock, long since worn thin, a testament to the profound endurance required just to exist. Under the bed, an overflowing, fermenting chamber pot added to the pervasive foul odours. Emptying it seemed an effort too great a futile gesture in the face of such pervasive uncleanliness. Why bother when the entire world outside your door seemed equally mired in filth? The rooms were physically deteriorating too, with plaster sagging on the ceiling, threatening to collapse, a constant low-level anxiety in a space designed solely for transient profit, never for comfort or permanence. And despite the suffocating humidity, the rooms were perpetually colder than they should be, with chilling breezes sneaking through window cracks, a constant physical discomfort that mirrored the profound emotional isolation, the pervasive chill that seeped into your very soul. Each new day in this cramped, contaminated space was a fresh testament to the relentless grind of a life that offered no true reprieve, no genuine comfort, preparing you for the next basic yet agonizing struggle for survival. That physical discomfort and profound emotional isolation, the relentless chill that seeped into your soul, found its harsh counterpart in the gnawing, pervasive reality of hunger. In Storyville, hunger was not an event, a temporary inconvenience between meals. It was a chronic, dull state of being as constant and inescapable as the humidity or the pain in your joints. It was an internal companion from the moment you opened your eyes until the rare, blessed moments you found a few meagre crumbs to quiet its insistent demands. This wasn't the sharp pang of a missed meal, but a deep, pervasive emptiness that drained your energy, dulled your senses, and made every effort feel like an uphill battle. Meals, when they came, were scarce and profoundly unsatisfying. Often they consisted of mere crumbs, literally the scraps left over perhaps from a madame's table or a client's half-eaten plate. At best, you might receive a half a heel of bread and a spoonful of lard, of questionable hygiene consumed out of desperate, undeniable necessity. The texture of the dry, tough bread, the greasy taste of the lard were endured rather than savoured a grim fuel for a body constantly on the edge of collapse. There was no joy in this sustenance, only the grim satisfaction of having staved off the worst of the hunger pangs, if only for a few hours. Obtaining even these meagre provisions frequently involved degrading transactional exchanges that further stripped away your dignity. You might encounter a butcher's boy, his gaze indifferent, and silently quickly trade 10 minutes and no talking for stale bakery rolls and sour cheese. It was a transaction of bodies for basic needs, a further reminder of how deeply commodified your existence was. No pleasantries, no lingering eye contact, just a swift utilitarian exchange that underscored the desperate nature of your hunger and the lengths you would go to satisfy it. The act of eating itself became a survival ritual, a poignant, almost heartbreaking performance of hope. You learned to savour each dry bite, letting your tongue linger on every crumb, pretending it's more than it is. This wasn't just about physical satiation. It was a psychological coping mechanism, a desperate attempt to make meagre sustenance feel substantial, to infuse a moment of fleeting pleasure into a life devoid of it. You would close your eyes between bites, conjuring images of abundance of fine wines and rich meats, anything to escape the immediate stark reality of dry bread and sour cheese. Food once acquired was fiercely guarded. Even a fourth roll, a rare luxury, would be carefully wrapped for later hidden away like precious gold, reflecting the constant gnawing fear of deprivation and a learned understanding of future scarcity. There was no assumption of tomorrow's meal, no certainty of another bite. Every scrap was precious, a potential lifeline. And in this grim ritual of sustenance, the casual sharing of space with flies landing on your knuckles, being ignored as you ate, highlighted a grim acceptance of coexisting with elements that, like the rest of Storyville, seemed to feed off you. It was a pervasive, unspoken truth in this world. Everything, even the smallest insect, seemed to be taking its due, leaving you with ever less, further cementing the slow, inexorable march towards your ultimate unnoticed demise. And so, as we gently pull back from the gaslit streets and humid air of 1890s Storyville, leaving behind the quiet struggles and profound realities we've explored, allow your mind to slowly drift back to the comfort of your own time, your own space. The echoes of suffering, the relentless grind of a life defined by systemic exploitation, can now soften, fading into the peaceful quiet of your present moment. It is a profound contrast, isn't it, to think of those lives marked by the constant presence of hunger, the pervasive ache of illness, and the chilling indifference of a society that saw them as mere commodities. Yet here you are, perhaps tucked into a soft bed, breathing clean air, with the promise of food and comfort readily available. Allow that gentle warmth of gratitude for your own circumstances to wash over you, a quiet appreciation for the freedoms and securities that many in the past could only dream of, and which for the harlots of New Orleans remained an impossible fantasy. The purpose of history, after all, isn't always to thrill or to excite, but sometimes simply to illuminate, to remind us of the human experience in its myriad forms, and to allow us a moment of quiet reflection before we gently close our eyes. May the whispers of the past now become a soft, comforting lullaby, guiding you deeper into a tranquil and restorative sleep. Let the images fade, the sounds quiet, and the weight of the story lift, leaving only a sense of calm peace.